Fiona Weir, I'm Chief Executive of Gingerbread, the Single Parent Families Charity.
Okay, and you're all welcome. Now we've got 2 panels this morning with lots of people giving evidence, so I hope you don't mind if we do rush through things, so don't feel offended if we do move things along, but obviously time is quite precious for us this morning. Lois, the first set of questions I'm going to give specifically to you about Derbyshire's experience, because you're obviously representing the view from the local authorities. So how many people just on average a month present to your council saying that they require emergency financial assistance, and as a result of benefit sanction? It might be more than that, but as a result of benefit sanction.
Okay. We don't specifically sample for benefit sanction every month. Over the course of the first year, we had 13,744 applications to the fund. That increased over the course of the first year and is increasing continually through the second year. So on average at the moment we have 1,300 a month applications, no less than that. Indeed, in the most recent week we had nearly 500 applications in 1 week. Of that, we sample over periodic times for different causes of demand. And the most recent sample that we have the data on, which was May 14, 15% of the people that were presenting because of a benefit sanction issue, and a further 40% were presenting because of a benefit delay issue. So over half of the demand for the fund was, in that time, was coming as a result of difficulties with the benefit system.
And while you don't have the actual data since then, what's your sense of what's happening in terms of the trends?
I think it's still consistently at the same level. We did do some sampling last week, which the data for which is very raw, and we haven't fully analysed that yet. As a proportion, the number of people that came through with benefit sanctions last week was lower, but I think the number was the same. We have a spike every January, so I think there were other reasons that people were applying in the most recent sample period that we did. But our sense is that the number of sanctions that we're seeing, the number of people who have difficulty because of sanctions, is at a consistent level. It's not dropping.
Yes.
Why is there a spike in January?
I think there's a managing income situation. I think we have different trends. We don't fully understand what the drivers always are, but certainly in both Januaries that we've been operating the fund, we've seen an increase in demand, and we also see an increased demand in things like school holiday times, just people finding it difficult to manage their money. In August last year, we had a spike when the tax credit system had a difficulty around people who were moving education establishments, and we had a lot of families coming in saying my tax credits have stopped. So there's kind of quite immediate responses in terms of what the requests that we get.
It wouldn't have anything to do with winter fuel, or is it costs of Christmas that might be putting extra financial pressure on families?
I think it could be both of those things.
Yeah. But we're obviously interested from the sanctions point of view. So what's the total number then that your council has helped over the 2-year period?
In the first year it was 13,744, and at the moment we're having no less than 1,300 applications a month over this current year, so we're expecting that to be much higher. And
how much is that costing the council, and to what extent, how much of that is covered by money that comes direct from central government?
It's all the scheme is funded by the money that's come from central government in both years. And in the first year, the Derbyshire Discretionary Fund total spend was 1.1 million, and this year our projection is that we're going to be around about 1.6 million. And
that has been made, it's not coming out of the council's own resources, it has been made?
No, it's from a local welfare assistance funding.
Okay. Do you know if your experience is typical of other, because you're the only witness we've got from the local government, how typical is your experience, Derbyshire's experience?
I think we in terms of whether we're a typical fund, there are some councils that do very different provision to us. I think that the demand for support, the drivers for support that we have are similar across lots of other local welfare assistance, and also in common with food banks, and the evidence that you've previously heard from food banks, there's similar issues there. The report that came out from the Centre for Responsible Credit recently was suggesting that local welfare assistance schemes are finding similar problems and similar themes, and certainly our experience would chime in with that.
Now, you talked about the sampling that you do. what we discovered in the last evidence session is that sometimes people think they've been sanctioned when they haven't been sanctioned. Either they've been disallowed or their benefit has been suspended. And it's actually quite difficult for someone else to work out what is actually going on if the claimant themselves don't know. So how do you cope with that? How do you know that the figures that you're quoting are as a result of sanction rather than just other problems with the benefit system?
We have two ways of knowing that. One is that the Derbyshire Discretionary Fund team, the local welfare assistance team, have access to the DWP CIS system, so they can see some of the reasons that people are having difficulties, and they also have conversations with job centre staff around what is the issue behind this person's present difficulty. And the second part of that is that we refer into the other team, which I manage, which is the Welfare Rights Service, and they then get underneath the need and the benefits advice need and try and resolve the issue, so that we're confident that the people that we're talking about and the examples that we're giving are actually sanctions and not other reasons.
So you're quite happy, your figures are robust, but there's the sense that people have is maybe that there's actually more need through the discretionary fund as a result of benefit sanction than your figures would suggest. Do you think that's again because people are thinking that they're coming as a result of a benefit sanction, but in reality when you look at it they're not, it's other financial pressures that are under?
Yeah, certainly there's a wider picture of people who've got problems with the benefit system, and those may be new claims, and we talked about short-term benefit advances because sadly they haven't always been told about those already, and there are wider issues, there are wider difficulties that cause problems, but the examples we've given of sanction, we're clear they are sanction situations.
Do you want to come quickly?
Go back to the discretionary fund.
Yeah.
Is it capped, and does government ever query?
We were given an allocation of money, and the Department for Work and Pensions has done a consultation, a request for information about how that's been used, and published that as a data set. But it's up to each individual council how they decide to use that money and how much of it gets used in the way that Derbyshire is using it and how much of it gets used in other ways.
Thank you for that, but when I say, does the government ever query it, does the government ever say, this isn't actually a valid claim, as far as, or they accept, do they, that the local authorities' disbursement of the discretionary fund?
Absolutely, it's left to the local authority to disperse it as they see fit, as we see fit as a fund.
Thank you.
Okay. Nigel's got some more questions on this.
I suppose one thing I would see from my casework at times is that people don't always realise they can challenge a sanction when they've got one. Is that the kind of same situation you find, that people have got a good excuse but just haven't realised they could appeal it? Absolutely.
I would say there was two things. One is that our experience is that people don't realise they've been sanctioned often until the money doesn't appear in the bank. So there's a time lag there. And then the second thing is when they go to the job centre and query that they're not made aware, or that they don't come away aware that they can challenge that sanction, and how they go about doing that.
And that's not a situation so that you've seen change in recent months, it's still the same as it was when you started this process?
No, that's the same as ever.
Part of the problem is the letters themselves. They're actually very difficult for claimants to understand. So, I mean, if I just quote from one, we've looked at your claim again, we can't pay you JSA. This is because we recently told you that a decision will be made about a doubt on whether you fail to comply with requirements. From X date your allowance will be X. So at no point does it say, A, you've been sanctioned, what you've been sanctioned for, the reasons for that decision, whether you can apply for a hardship payment or whether you can appeal. So it's a very, very kind of uninformative letter. So even if people get that letter, it's unsurprising that they don't understand the reason for the sanction. And we've come across a lot of cases where the letter comes after the sanction has happened and sometimes even refers to an earlier date. So it's impossible for the claimant to actually do anything to rectify the situation.
As a sort of anecdotal example, we had a lady in recently who went to the job centre to find out why she hadn't had any money. She was told she would be sanctioned from the system. The officer she was dealing with could see that and said, the letter's upstairs with the team upstairs, and you have to go away and wait for the letter to come back, and then you'll be able to challenge it. So there was it was in the same building.
And so the best way to fix this would be to improve that letter, make sure it's out before the sanction and it's clear what's going on.
I would argue that there should be the requirement in law that someone has been properly informed of a decision before a sanction can actually be imposed, because otherwise it's a breach of natural justice, because the claimant can't possibly make the case for good reason if they don't know something's happened.
Can I just ask a question? Because Clark just reminded me that he's seen letters that say the things that you say this letter doesn't say, Alison. I'm just wondering whether that's different letters are going out in different parts of the country, or whether they have already changed the letter. Do you have any?
I don't think so. We haven't come across.
If you don't know, I'd find this a question for us for other things. Sorry. Debbie, did you want to come in?
No, I do.
Are you ready?
Can I?
I'll let Nigel. Yeah. Okay. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you. Just on the point of the. They're job seekers at the end of the day, aren't they? They're job seekers that have been sanctioned. I have 2 job centres in my constituency. I'm going to one tomorrow, and I've visited my other one last week, and I went into great detail on the processes. And what you're talking about is a letter. And you're quite right. I wouldn't defend the fact that the letter's in the same building and it's on the way. And I've seen some letters which I think are inappropriate, and more work should be done in terms of the wording and how it's explained. However, there's been lengthy conversations with these job seekers about job opportunities, not turning up for interviews, or the agreement that they've signed up to, and these are all verbal conversations over several weeks. The letter is the final part, and it is the thing that you're rightly pointing out is perhaps not done appropriately. But these people have had conversations with job centre staff over months, over weeks, in terms of finding employment and getting jobs. So it's not totally news to the claimants that they're going to get sanctioned. They would have been told that they're going to get sanctioned if they don't turn up for an appointment. Is that your experience? It's not just a case. It's not just a case that they don't.
Fiona's desperate to come in, and then we'll get the others as well.
There is an ongoing dialogue with job centre staff, and the letter is the final thing that you're being sanctioned. They've had several discussions with job centre plus staff. That's the point I'm making.
I think there's a massive difference between the system as described by Job Centre Plus and the system as it actually works. And I think one of the things that points to that we've drawn attention to is the incredibly and unacceptably high level of non-adverse sanction decisions, i.e. things that are wasting massive amounts of time, causing distress and financial hardship, and are actually wrong decisions in the first place. And in the case of single parents, a lot of them are because despite years of having these conversations with Job Centre Plus and being given assurances that there'll be a new level of training and communication improvement, Job Centre Plus advisors either don't have enough time, that these lengthy conversations are not lengthy, they're very quick and box ticking, or they themselves are not properly.
I've seen job centre staff have lengthy, ongoing conversations over weeks and months to try and help these people.
And sometimes they do, but the fact that the Oakley review showed very strongly, and certainly our experience is that a large number of claimants don't fully understand the process. They don't understand the flexibilities that are there for single parents, and we consistently log examples of Job Centre Plus telling people they have to work night shifts or they'll be sanctioned. These kind of examples we have multiple ones of. And there is something very dysfunctional about the system at the moment. Some bits of it may be working very well, but it's patchy and inconsistent, and the sheer number of non-adverse decisions shows that the system is not working, and that time is being taken up not on conversations about how to support somebody into work, but on conversations about sanctions and good cause and how the system's working, that are leading to a lot of time being taken up on decisions that need to be overturned. So it needs quite fundamental review at the moment. It would be good to look at the business case for actually switching Job Centre Plus advisor time back to refocusing on support into work and a lot less time on administering this process. A crucial first recommendation you could look at would be not to leap into an actual sanction decision initially, certainly to give discretion to work programme advisors, but also more discretion with Job Centre Plus, to have a first informal warning discussion with somebody that this is the sort of thing that might lead to a sanction before you go into this process and get a big pile of wrongful decisions that then have to be overturned, and somebody's already gone through this distress and fear of sanctions.
Okay, back to Nigel.
Lois, we're back to you. Of the survey you gave us the details of, I think over half of people who applied for funds from your discretionary fund had also applied for a hardship fund payment in the first place. I mean, is that, I guess people to understand why people are having to apply for both. Is that because the hardship fund isn't enough, or is it because it's too late, or is it a bit of both?
Both, if I may say so. There are clearly some people who can't access hardship immediately, and so they can come to us while they're waiting for the hardship to become a possibility. And there are other people who don't know about the hardship fund, and we will have that conversation with them. But if you've got somebody who's presenting and saying, I have no food, I need to feed my family, to send them back to the job centre, saying, no, you've got to go and talk to somebody else about whether they'll give you hardship, and then come back to us, you end up sort of risking a game of ping pong between agencies. So, and then you have people who have access to hardship payment, but for their particular circumstances, that wasn't sufficient to see them through the immediate crisis of not having their full amount of benefit available.
In 2012, DWP's research found that less than a fifth of single parents had been told about the hardship fund, and only 5% had actually received a hardship fund payment. And I think there's a particular case where you've got children in a family, because we have to take responsibility for the welfare of a child that is in a household that may have lost benefit payments. And we would strongly recommend that hardship payments become automatic for single-parent families, because of the inevitable consequences of cutting benefits on a family where there is a child, and that child should not be suffering the adverse impact of this process.
I would agree with that. The work we do in food banks, and we've done research in a range of food banks, very few of the people coming to the food bank have ever got any notice of it.
I was going to say, Alison, as well, echoing what everyone said here, the research that we've been doing in food banks, it's very rare that people have actually know that there's hardship fund to actually access, let alone have accessed it. More often than not, I'll ask people, are you getting hardship? And they're like, oh, what's that? So it seems to be quite a lot of confusion around that issue.
Some people are not entitled for a hardship payment for the first 14 days unless they're in a vulnerable group. So then there's a list of people who are vulnerable groups, which includes people with children, people coming out of care, people who are carers with chronic medical conditions and so on. But the problem is that most of the people we come across simply don't know that hardship payments exist. And then there's a second problem, which is in order to get one, you have to actually attend in person at a Job Centre Plus office and fill in a 10-page form. Now, for some people, if they have these medical conditions, or they have children at home, or they live a great distance from Job Centre Plus, it's actually quite difficult for them to do that, but they're unable to do it by telephone, for example. And we have examples of people who've had that delayed by DWP, who've said, you may be able to claim a hardship payment, but not now, you have to come back on Monday. So there are a lot of problems with getting them.
How do people find out about your services, Lois? I mean, is it they've been sanctioned, they hit trouble, and they find it on the internet, or they find it by some friend tells them? Or?
A big majority of claimants, I would say, by the job centre. And it seems to be that the job centre either identify the Derbyshire Discretionary Fund or signpost to us, when actually we'd quite like them to be having a conversation about hardship payments or short-term benefit advances first, and then seeing whether that can resolve the issue.
Yeah, that was where I was heading with that question. It seems strange that they don't advertise their own service before they advertise yours.
Absolutely. I mean, we do have a range of other agencies that we work with across Derbyshire. So there's children's centres, there's support workers, there's homelessness advisors. The full range that you would expect us to be networked into, we are. But certainly, the most frequent start of the conversation is I've been told to contact you by the job centre.
And people seem to be finding your discretionary service before they've had welfare rights advice. Is that something that you notice?
Yes, and there's a value in the fact that we have both available, and that we, if somebody comes to the Derbyshire Discretionary Fund and there is an advice need, then we can access that or help them to access that to resolve the underlying issue, because that's part of what we want to do. Is we don't want to have people continually needing local welfare assistance. The whole point is to try and fix the problem that's created the difficulty, created the crisis.
And why do you think people are not going for welfare advice before they're seeking help? Is that just lack of awareness? Or?
I think that's part of it, but I also think that if you don't have any money, then there's quite a hierarchy of need going on, and if you need to feed yourself or feed your children or your family, you think about that, you sort that one out, and once that's dealt with, you then think, have I got brain space now to think about challenging that decision? But there's quite a kind of crisis in that family situation, and that needs to be resolved. Okay,
and I guess my experience in my seat suggests there's pretty good welfare advice provision in when it gets out into all the towns. And I guess I'd probably see the same as you, as people choosing to get the money before they worry about fixing the system or something.
Dr. Garthwaite, you were nodding quite there. Is there anything you wanted to add about the welfare rights side of things?
Yeah, I think sometimes a lot of people who come to the food bank, I'll say to them, have you been to the Citizens Advice Bureau? And sometimes it's the actual anxiety with people with mental health problems. Often the thought of actually going and having to sort of, explain to someone else about the problems and actually seeking advice. I think seeking sort of help can be a big first step for people. And at the food bank, often people are, it's a last resort. They've exhausted all the options available to them, so they come to the food bank. And sometimes that can actually be a turning point for people in that they can then access Citizens Advice Bureau. I know in the food bank that I've been working with for the past 14 months, there's actually now Citizens Advice Bureau actually come to the food bank twice a week, so we can actually say to people, well, you've got this issue with your housing or something, Citizens Advice Bureau are here, and it can actually help you with that issue right now, rather than you having to go and perhaps wait for however long to get an appointment with the relevant person.
Okay. I've got Debbie and Paul.
Thank you. We heard at the last oral hearing from Professor Weir from York around the universal credit regulations, which extend conditionality to people who are in work, so people who are on low pay in receipt of working tax credits. And currently we have, I think it's 2.1 million families with children who are on working tax credits and 2.6 million single parents with children who are accessing working tax credits. Would you like to comment on the potential? If you look at the autumn statement budget book, you can see the reduction in working tax credit payments. Would you like to comment on potentially, I have asked the question to the Secretary of State and he wasn't able to tell me anything on, but the implications for sanctions for people in work on low pay?
Well, there are implications in the future in that under universal credit there will be in-work conditionality. So just as the number of occasions for which you can be sanctioned has grown because there are a new category of sanctions related to work-related activity. There were always sanctions relating to being unemployed voluntarily or not being entitled in the first place because you don't fulfil the conditions. But what's grown is these fixed-length sanctions in relation to not carrying out work-related activity. In future, that will apply to low-paid people too, if they're not working sufficient hours or the equivalent of 35 hours at minimum wage. They'll be required to increase their hours or level of pay. So sanctioning could become more of a feature of working lives as well as people who are out of work.
Fiona, do you want to add to that?
It's really not clear how DWP will implement it, or that they would apply sanctions to people who are actually in jobs. It would certainly be an extraordinary development to start sanctioning somebody for not taking sufficient steps to try and grow their hours, and very difficult to see how it would work in a context where we find many people are involuntary part-time working or on zero-hour contracts and can't get the hours they want, so they're already banging their head against how do I get the hours I want without having to kind of demonstrate that they're trying to work hard enough to increase their hours. So I think we need to get a much clearer statement from DWP about how they see the in-work conditionality regime being implemented.
One of the problems about challenging these sanction decisions is that by the time even if you succeed in arguing you had good reason, or you can get it revised under a mandatory reconsideration or an appeal, by that time you've already lived for a considerable period of time without any money, so it's often too late. So hence people turning up at food banks or local welfare assistance schemes. But I would add to that we've come across local welfare assistance schemes that turn people down simply on the grounds that they've been sanctioned, and also local authorities that refuse discretionary housing payments because people have been sanctioned. So it's actually having a domino effect into other forms of support that they could get. And most of the people we see at Food Bank have never had advice before at all. And so when this brings us to the real problem with these fixed-length sanctions is that why they seem to be completely inappropriate for this work-related activity is that you can't do anything to rectify the situation because the sanction is fixed length. If you do the required behaviour that you seem to have failed to have done, it makes no difference. The sanction continues anyway, so it doesn't work. as a system to improve people's behaviour. It simply results in destitution.
Can I add to that? We're just losing track of the whole point of sanctions was meant to be to support people into work. And the fact is, when you're struggling to kind of, put food on the table because you're experiencing a sanction, you're not in very good shape to be looking for a job. And the fact is, we've had major reviews of the Job Centre Plus offer, and just last December, a whole series of reviews of the work programme, really solid DWP research. And in both cases, it shows that you are no more likely to get a job as a result of sanctions. That it's just not, it's affecting certain types of behaviours, but the majority of claimants see it as unnecessary and irrelevant because they see themselves as highly motivated to work, and our experiences most are, and that practically you are not getting better job outcomes as a result. So the whole system has to stop looking at getting people's flow off benefit and start looking at sustainable job outcomes again. Because on the work programme, you're more likely to get a sanction than a job. The sanction figures are higher than the jobs achieved. And we're just focusing the whole system around administration of conditionality. When we're talking every day to people who are crying out for skilling up, work experience, some time with a specialist lone parent advisor, now a very rare breed indeed, people want the support. That's what they want from Job Centre Plus. They want it to be pragmatic, realise most of them want a job and support them to get it. And they're walking into a system that is totally geared up around the assumption that somehow you won't make efforts to get a job unless you're threatened with sanctions.
Very briefly, do you have any examples? I quote one of one of my constituents who was sanctioned while in the middle of a work capability assessment, who had a heart attack and was sanctioned, as I say, in the middle. But have you... So we've reported about the appropriateness of sanctions and that they often aren't. If you've got a very brief examples, and I'm in the middle of Nigel's question, so...
Very brief panic phone call from a mum, recently made a single mum, got 2 young kids, one with health difficulties, can't be left on their own. She can't cope with her shift work any longer because she's now on her own. Phoned Job Centre Plus for advice and was told that she would be sanctioned for 3 years if she gave up her job. Now, it was completely wrong advice, but you can imagine the kind of panic somebody is in by the time they come to us, having been on the receiving end of wrong advice. And this is the kind of thing that we can all give daily examples of.
Yes, and it's the sort of thing that people can't do anything about as well. We came across one case in Scotland where someone had actually attended a work programme interview, but DWP still sanctioned them on the belief that they hadn't attended. And this person then actually committed a crime in order to feed themselves. So it's leading to consequences that have nothing to do with work activation.
We have examples of clients who have been missed telephone interviews with work programme providers, that there was no record of that telephone call ever happening. So fortunately we do get those turned over on mandatory reconsideration, but it's another example of time spent doing something that really didn't need to be doing.
Going to Paul.
Specifically to Alison, but you've all talked about the flaws in the process of inappropriate letters, bad process, all of which I think we can recognise from our own constituency casework. The Oakley review looked at improving the quality of the literature. It looked at notifying of hardship payments. As far as I'm aware, the department is either in the process of updating the letters or has updated, not quite sure what tense to use. We explored that. Equally, the DWP evidence states that since the 14th of July 2014, no one can be sanctioned without being told of the availability of hardship payments, that they have invested in accelerating the payment of those hardship payments. Have any of you seen evidence since July 2014 of that occurring? No. Okay, that's fine. That just allows me to ask the Minister when we have her to then take feedback. Specifically to Fiona, your evidence slightly contradicts something that we had last time regarding the likelihood of lone parents to be sanctioned. Centre for Economic and Social Inclusion says that lone parents are substantially less likely to be sanctioned than we would expect. Now, Kayleigh, your evidence is about non-adverse decisions.
Yes.
So
you're absolutely right.
Yeah.
Single parents are less likely to be sanctioned and go into the sanction system than other claimants. But once they go into the sanction system, they are much more likely to have a non-adverse
Which is going to
decision.
be my vote, because something you said earlier, clearly there's an issue here with the first part of the process of engagement with the Job Centre Plus for lone parents. You were talking about the issues of formal and informal warnings.
Yes.
Could we have some sort of discretion?
Yes.
I wanted to explore that philosophically without this taking too long, in the sense that we would all think it common sense to have a brief chat with someone to say, if you do this, X will occur. That's an informal discussion, if you like. It won't appear in any statistics anywhere or anyone's record, so in a sense it almost doesn't exist. The moment you start to move to a more formal system whereby you have to have given someone a warning of some sort, that discretion becomes formalised, if you like. So you're moving it forward in the decision-making process. You then start to have another argument, or shouldn't you be having an informal discussion before you start the formal discretion? And you start to go around in circles. We would all agree common sense says you need to have some form of discretion. The Job Centre Plus advisors I speak to all say that they already have that informal discussion and deploy that discretion. How do you think we can resolve this tension so that common sense can apply, but there's a formal system that allows everyone to feel that natural justice, as Alison mentioned, is being done? Sorry, too long a question.
Well, and it's also Anne-Marie's question as
well. My apologies, Anne-Marie. I didn't beg your pardon.
Can I have a partial explanation? That there used to be, in relation to sanctions for qualifying for benefit, there used to be a list of what good cause was. And examples of what those might be. Those have all been taken away now and applied to none of the occasions where sanctions might be applied. So decision makers don't have any kind of guidance about what sort of thing, like transport problems, childcare problems, might be a good reason. So it leaves it open to say anything. Is a failure to meet the conditions. And that's really unhelpful. It would be really useful to bring something like that back.
Okay,
I think IRSA raised it as part of their evidence, but it's particularly a problem with the work programme where they really are required to refer people across, and they can't just have that basic conversation and say, why didn't you turn up or why were you late? And when it's fairly obviously a good cause, be able to say to them, look, that's exactly the kind of situation that will get you sanctioned if it happens again, and then be able to just leave it at that and move on.
That requires legislative change.
Before we go into Anne-Marie, who's got the Gingerbread, I think there's a brief question from Glenda.
Thank you. To go back a bit, speaking about the kind of anxieties that are produced in people when there's sanctions, we have had evidence of people simply giving up on Job Centre Plus and never going back. Do you have any figures to support that, any kind of over and above anecdotal evidence? I've got it from my own constituency, but I mean, are there any figures to show? Because these people aren't going into jobs. That's the bottom line. They're just never going back to Job Centre Plus.
Yeah, I haven't got any figures on that, but I have seen examples of people who come to the food bank who actually say, well, I've been for my ESA, work capability assessment, and I've been found fit for work, but I feel like I can't apply for job seekers allowance because I can't fulfil the conditionality that requires me to fulfil. So I have come across, it's not common, but it's something I've come across in the past 40 months of doing the research.
Thank you.
I think that's a question for our next panel, probably. Sheila.
Yeah, it's really perhaps just to pursue, we're sometimes talking about two different things, I think. There's giving people warnings that if you do this, that might happen. And then there's what actually happens when there's a sanctions referral. And the experience of some of my constituents is it's not they don't necessarily understand it or they haven't had those informal discussions, but when there's a referral for sanction, the money stops, that particular incident is really quite different. So they know in theory, if I don't apply for X jobs or I don't go to that interview, I could be sanctioned. But when the sanction happens, they're, say it is because they had transport difficulties or child fell ill or something, which might be good cause. So the two, I'm not sure they're absolutely the same things, whether informal discussions are enough or whether, if it's the first incident of that, giving somebody a kind of yellow card is a different, it's a different phase of the process. You can understand it, I think, perfectly well, can't you? And still something happens.
This is why we think you need a 14-day period before a sanction can be imposed, because otherwise you don't have the opportunity to have that conversation, because people don't know, in many cases, that it's about to happen. Plus, the decisions are often made on quite kind of frail grounds. You know, you've been asked to look at 48 job sites and you didn't have access to a computer, so you looked at 47 and you get sanctioned. And these kind of things are ridiculous.
And I think it's also why we get into the kind of discussions we're having where Job Centre Plus says, but we produced a new leaflet, or we've improved our communications, or we've done something. And in good faith, they think they are making the improvements. But what they keep underestimating is how hard it is for a lot, particularly more vulnerable claimants, to actually take it in and digest and understand the implications. And that's why nothing beats a relationship of trust with your advisor, and actually having some time so they can ask you to recap on what your understanding of something is and how you think it might apply to your own circumstances, because that's the point at which I think it begins to sink in and the understanding really...
I think that's a really important point. Sorry, just following on from what Fiona's saying, we have really huge amounts of evidence from DWP evaluations of previous New Deal programmes and employment support programmes about what works in terms of work activation, and it's the relationship of trust with the personal advisor. There's no evidence that sanctions actually improves people's work activation. In fact, there's evidence to the contrary, that it's less likely to lead to positive work outcomes and job retention. It's more likely to lead to people to be alienated from the work programme. So I think we need to, DWP could well look at its own evidence. It has a lot of evidence. And there are schemes, for example, like the New Deal for lone parents, that doubled lone parents' chances of getting a job, but it was an entirely voluntary scheme. There were no sanctions involved. So the successful aspect of it was the engagement with the personal advisor.
Just going back to going back to a phrase that Alison used, which was frail grounds. We have lots of we don't have those analysis in a statistical form, but we have lots of examples of sanction decisions being made for what we could regard as frail grounds. You haven't done enough job search over Christmas, but the library and the job centres were all closed. That's not we're not the only ones with that experience, clearly. But then if we talk to claimants about, so they present at the Derbyshire Discretionary Fund in need of support, we talk to them about doing a mandatory reconsideration. A mandatory reconsideration can take 7 to 11 weeks, by which time they've had 4 weeks without income. They've struggled. We may well have supported them in that situation, and they also, the resolution of that in terms of an overturned decision on mandatory reconsideration has come quite too late for that immediate crisis. We also have claimants, I don't know whether others have similar experience, where by the time they've sort of got into the mandatory reconsideration process, they've managed through whatever reason, through our support or other reasons, to see through that period, and actually they sort of lose faith and lose heart with the point of doing the challenge and exit that process. And our great concern is if there's another frail reason for a sanction decision in the future, that's a 13-week sanction. Yes. So we really do want to talk to people and say, you need to get this 4-week one sorted, even if you have weathered the storm, because that's there now, and the next one is going to be a 13-week one if there's another situation that arises.
Yeah, I'd just like to add to that as well. I think it can be sometimes a problem, particularly for new job seekers, especially with health problems, people who are, they've worked for a long time and they're new to the benefit system. I've seen people who've come to the food bank who actually have, through sort of genuine mistake, actually missed an appointment at the job centre, and they haven't sort of realised the acceleration of what will actually happen when they do then get sanctioned. So I think for people who are new to the whole benefit system, I think sometimes there can be quite confusion there in terms of,
And we have an example of letters being sent out with the DWP dated the 25th of December and stuff. So, Anne-Marie, we're finally on to you and your single parents.
Right, well, we've actually covered quite a bit on single parents, but Fiona, perhaps I could prevail upon you maybe to pull together some of the comments that you've made and you've been made by others. I think fundamentally what you're saying is with regard to these non-adverse decisions, the system doesn't work, it's a waste of money, you've got a two-tier process between Job Centre and DWP, and you said that there really is not the help and guidance, there aren't the specialists that there were on the ground, and you're concerned about the level of training and indeed the awareness of the individuals as to the whole flexibility regime. If you had a magic wand, listening to everything that Paul and others have said, maybe we could drill down to a little more detail as to how you would change the system to deal with those faults in it.
Okay. Fundamentally, the system has to be designed for the majority of claimants who want to work, and most single parents are highly motivated to work. Most DWP reports say that. So you have to start with that aspiration, and you have to give them time to overcome the barriers and opportunities to skill up, time with an advisor, work experience and so on. And that's what they're looking for when they come to the system fundamentally. So you need to refocus Job Centre Plus very much around sustainable job outcomes and working with the aspirations that most of their clients have, and see sanctions as kind of back in that box called last resort, use sparingly for the small number of cases, not the predominant culture that hits you when you go into Job Centre Plus. So I think there is something very fundamental about culture, about rewarding Job Centre Plus advisors on sustainable outcomes, not on how they're processing conditionality and benefit offloads and so on. And that really gets back to, in a very pragmatic, what works way. Let's look at what works. We know stacks of DWP reports say it's advisor time. We know that there are important things you have to do, like childcare costs that government is addressing, and we hope we'll do more on. Get those bits into place, but actually move the focus. The new government that responds to your inquiry needs to take a fundamental look, not just the process changes we've been recommending at the margins, but a fundamental look at pragmatic, effective getting people into work. That's what people want. That's what, you know, the vast majority of claimants coming through, and it's what every citizen who wants to see the welfare bill fall wants. We just want to see people supported into a sustainable job. And at the moment, the system's just not geared up around that as the predominant culture.
Okay, can we drill down a bit as to how you do that? Because the challenge is, culture change is probably one of the most difficult changes to make.
Yes.
How would you do it? What you're talking about is quite a lot of face time, and
Yes.
that's expensive. I'm not saying that that isn't
Yes.
the right way to do it. But so how do we make that efficient? Do we actually train
Yes.
everybody a bit, or do we still have specialists? And is there any information that we give to single parents before they come? So in a sense, they're already kind of
I think you need specialist lone parent advisors. They've been proven to be very effective in the past. I think you need very high quality information about the single parent flexibilities and how they apply, and that needs to be very clear and checked at the claimant commitment stage. I think you need to performance manage Job Centre Plus advisors using the right indicators, and they have to be sustainable job outcomes, and we should be challenging government saying that's too expensive, because it's clearly the right way forward. Job Centre Plus advisors would love to have a workplace culture that was more geared around supporting clients into work. What they're getting is signals from the top that the system has to be seen to be essentially enforcing a conditionality regime. And the predominant signal from the top, and it's from the new government, and whichever complexion that government is, and this is an area where we would say to each major political party, you need to rethink the current consensus about how the sanctions regime is working, and start getting back to basics on, you know, sustainable job outcomes. That's what we're here for.
With regard to the claimant commitment, what you're saying is that we could do a better job at that point of explaining flexibilities, etc. Is that now completely absent? Is it mentioned at all?
There's a huge amount that goes on, and if you look at the processes, procedures, Job Centre Plus has got a lot of the key things in place you would expect and want. The problem is getting them applied consistently across Job Centre Plus. We're picking up on a huge amount of patchiness that's causing problems. And the other problem is sheer pressure on advisor time. It would be really worth examining the business case for how much time all the decision-making processes are taking up, because they're very time-consuming, and advisor time, you know, Job Centre Plus advisor time is at a premium. We know when there was new conditionality introduced for income support, government put a really big chunk of money into the system just to administer the new conditionality regime. So I think somebody does need to look hard at where advisor time is going, and whether long term you'd get a better use of advisor time if they were focused on getting people into work and spending less time overturning poor decision making. So we would really ask you to ask the Minister to kind of take some steps to initiate some of those kind of assessments.
And in the short term, given cultural change takes a long time, what you've pointed to is really a waste, and frankly everybody would see it as a waste, of a two-part process. What could be done with regard to the working relationship and all processes between Job Centre and DWP to stop, if you like, while we sort the problem out, these non-adverse decisions?
In terms of the process reviews, I think some of it is around getting safeguards into place. So you need to give time for the decision-making processes to work their way through. You need to have time before benefit cuts actually kick in. Ideally, you need to have some automaticity about hardship payments, because we keep losing track of the fact that there are children in these families, and there are real question marks about the ethics of a sanctioning regime that is affecting children who are not accountable for what is happening. So you need to put a lot more of those safeguards in place to make sure that you are not having vulnerable people suffering from a system that should be there to provide them with support.
We've come across cases, for example, where lone parents are afraid to mention that they have childcare difficulties because of the background of fear of sanction. So they think if they say that, it'll count against them in some way, whereas in fact the lone parent flexibilities are there to help them with that situation, and there are even funds that could help them with childcare costs to attend. But because of the level of fear, they're not even having that discussion, and that's a real problem.
Do you think there's also perhaps an argument for, while specialists clearly are better, but pro tem, because they'll take a while, some sort of general training so that all advisors have a better general understanding?
I think the training, there has to be accredited training to a standard, because advisors are taking essentially judicial decisions that profoundly affect the level of income that very poor families will have. And that's an extraordinary power to give to somebody, and therefore we should take very, very seriously the responsibility for making those decisions well.
Thank you.
Quickly for Glenda, and then Glenda first, and then you do it.
It's really to pick up on the point that you made, Alison, with regard to single parents, where they don't discuss their childcare because of fear. But how much does an employer's reluctance to be flexible with regard to the shift work that often is what is being presented to a single parent? I mean, this is only anecdotal from my own constituency, but I've had 3 cases where single mums, because there was such inflexibility on the part of the employer, that they couldn't take the job. Now, that was not the fault of the mother, it was the fault of the employer. Yes. And of course their business was dependent on shift work in that way. But what's the kind of linkage there if it comes close to sanctioning, which should never happen in my view for single parents anyway?
Well, that's what the lone parent flexibilities are supposed to be for.
Yeah, but they don't know about that.
No,
that's the point.
That's the problem. And also there's long-standing research that single parents are afraid to take certain types of jobs because they fear that they'll be sacked because of not being able to fulfil those conditions. Right. And again, that's what the lone parent flexibilities are for, so that you can place those restrictions.
But upon occasions, it seems to me, occasions, a couple of times, the urging of Job Centre Plus as this job being the one is incorrect. They should know, surely, if an employer is going to be inflexible in that way. There should be some kind of linkage, I would have thought, but there doesn't seem to be.
It ought to be a good reason to say a job won't work for you as a single
this
parent.
Has got to be,
absolutely,
yes,
and that should be
and
seen as
that
reasonable.
Doesn't seem to be said ever.
No.
Okay. Thank you.
Just continuing from Glenda's good point there, in my experience, you just said about advisors doing the sanctioning, and you mentioned tick box culture earlier. In my experience of Job Centre Plus staff, the decision to sanction somebody is not taken lightly, and it's not the individual advisor. There is the line managers have all been involved, and they've gone to great lengths to try and help the individual. And Glenda's point is exactly right. In my constituency, the Job Centre staff know of the jobs. There are jobs that are appropriate for people that work part-time with children and so on and so forth. So they've lined up interviews and so on and so forth, and they've failed to attend. So you keep saying that Job Centre staff using the tick box culture and putting people in sanctions, that's not my experience. Job centre staff work very hard on a case by case basis, and they don't take the decision lightly to put people on sanctions.
No, we're very positive about a lot of Job Centre Plus staff, but the facts are that over 43,000 single parents were wrongly referred for a sanction decision that a decision maker then decided should be non-adverse, and another 16,000 went to the next stage to decision review before the sanction was then decided that it was non-adverse. So the fact is there is quite a lot in the system.
Sure, I mean, there's a lot more to do. All I'm saying that not all job centre staff get it wrong. In my experience, they work very hard to help individuals on a case-by-case basis.
I think it's consistency is the key. We've got about 8 minutes for the last section, and Debbie's got it on health impact.
Thank you. Dr. Garthwaite, your submission to the committee describes the effects of sanctions on people who are already poorly, who are suffering from ill health, and particularly those that have mental health conditions. Could you tell me, how do sanctions affect people?
Yeah, well, our research has shown that for people who are using the food bank, they're likely to be living with already fairly long-term sort of financial problems that can include, low-wage work, accumulation of debt, issues with housing. For example, the bedroom tax, we see a lot of people who are affected by that additionally, issues of fuel poverty, and all of these things sort of combine to have a negative impact on already poor health often. And so when people are sanctioned, these problems are often aggravated even further because they've lost their only source of income. So then, therefore, they're going without sufficient food, sufficient energy that will maintain the health or even improve the health if they're recovering from illness. And also, I think another detrimental impact on mental health comes because people are often quite embarrassed and stigmatised about having to come to the food bank in the first place. They feel quite ashamed. There's a lot of stigma surrounding food bank use. So I think there's a lot of, as well, which has been mentioned this morning, a lot of distrust with the system and the feeling that, they're sort of the system's out to get them rather than actually there to support them, which is a shame because often people who come to the food bank, they say, I would love to work, but my health problems are, they're so poor, and I feel like I can't sort of maintain perhaps a full-time job, because of ongoing health problems.
Can you describe in a bit of detail in terms of how it manifests itself? So, for example, somebody who's already got mental health conditions. I mean, you describe a few case studies, and I think there was one woman who was so badly affected by it she didn't feel she could go out of the house.
Yeah, that's right.
So could you just describe that?
Yeah, the particular example is Jessica, who's in the case study 2 in our written evidence. And Jessica was actually 22 weeks pregnant when I met her at the food bank, and she'd walked over 2 miles to get to the food bank because she couldn't afford the public transport. And she was receiving ESA for her mental health problems, which had been triggered after she'd given birth to a stillborn birth of her son about 8 months ago. So since then she'd been finding her anxiety and mental health problems extremely difficult to cope with, and she missed one of her appointments, and despite letting the advisor know that she couldn't get in that day, she was sanctioned. And so from that, her mental health problems, there was sort of a spiral effect. Her worsening debts led her to seeking out Citizens Advice Bureau for some help with that. And she told me as well how she wasn't actually eating proper meals. She hadn't eaten a proper cooked meal for over 2 weeks. She was actually living on her sister's children's leftovers. She didn't have any electric in her flat. She said, I haven't had my fridge or my cooker switched on for 3 weeks. I can't afford the electric. I sold my telly last week. There was no point in keeping it because I can't afford to use it anyway. And unfortunately, cases like Jessica's aren't actually untypical. We see quite a lot of people coming to the food bank who are experiencing similar incidents, which are then therefore impacting on already poor mental health.
Thank you, Jessica. So, in terms of food, you mentioned the food bank use, and over 1 million people, or 1 million food parcels were provided last year, and I think 45. There are reports saying 45% are directly as a result of sanctions. In my constituency, it's actually 60%. But you also talk about the issues that, obviously, the food parcels are food that's not going to go off, so it's tend to be tinned or processed, and the implications that has for for health as a whole. Could you just describe that in a bit?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, food bank provision is intended to be emergency food. You know, it's nutritionally balanced for 3 days' worth of food for somebody in a crisis. But I think the problem that I'm seeing with people in the food bank, a crisis doesn't just last 3 days. It's longer-term financial, all sorts of problems that leading to people not being able to actually afford to eat the healthy food that they need to maintain their health. Particular examples that I've come across within the food bank which quite shocked me were people who have, for example, digestive problems such as irritable bowel syndrome or other deficiencies such as anemia, things like this. And people have reported how after they've received the food from the food bank, they've eaten food that aggravates the health already. So, you know, white pasta, white rice, processed foods. And there was an example of Naomi. She was suffering with irritable bowel syndrome, and she said, I ate the food that I received from the food bank, and then I was ill all over the weekend. I knew I would be. I knew from eating the white wheat-based food I would be poorly, but I was hungry, so I just suffered the consequences afterwards. And another example of how people living on low incomes who aren't able to afford the healthy food that they need for their health is, for example, Anna. And Anna was 51, and she has digestive problems that make consuming wheat and dairy difficult. And also she was also suffering with mental health problems. And Anna was sanctioned after she missed a job seekers allowance appointment. She was an example of someone who'd always worked in the past and was new to the benefit system, so she'd accidentally missed her appointment. And Anna had an 11-year-old daughter, and I met both of them in the food bank. It was in the school holidays. And Anna told me how she and her daughter had been having to eat tin food that were out of date and were often overlooking fresh produce because the more fruit and veg that they buy, the more chance of wastage. And I asked her how this was all impacting on her health, and she said, completely. Because of the anemia, my energy levels are so low, I nod off regularly, and towards the afternoon I don't have energy to do the housework. I'm not unintelligent. I know what I need to keep my levels going. I know what I need for my diet, but it's hard to keep that going when you're left with eating just bread with maybe chocolate spread on it, and that's all you've got for the day. Those carbohydrates are the short-lived things for energy. I know enough about that, what I should be eating, but you can't always manage to afford it. And she also went on to say, my daughter's been quite constipated recently. She's never been like that, and that's no good for her. We could always afford yogurts, things with fruit in, but now we really struggle to do that. And I think both of those examples show how people living on low incomes who can't afford healthy foods, how that can actually impact upon their health.
Absolutely. And we've got rises in deficiency diseases as well. Which, my last question, Dr. Garthwaite, is in terms of the transferability of your work. Now, obviously, this is a qualitative piece of work that you've undertaken. But would you like to comment in terms of how you think this could apply to other areas other than the North East and Stockton where you were working?
Yeah, I think obviously, as you say, our study is just focusing upon Stockton. But I think from looking at the range of written evidence and also other research that's coming out, looking at food banks, I think actually our findings are quite typical of what's been said already. You know, the recent emergency use only report just before Christmas that highlighted the impact of mental health issues for people who've been sanctioned. So I think it is a wider issue than just simply our case study. So I think it's an issue that's definitely got transferability.
Absolutely.
Can I add to that? I think there's some sort of an issue brewing or very prevalent for us which will continue, which is the correlation between people who are challenging ESA work capability assessment decisions and being in effect forced onto job seekers allowance, and then they end up not being able to comply with the job seekers agreement conditions and end up being sanctioned. So there's a kind of another unvirtuous circle there, and we certainly have a number of people that we're concerned about who we've got one lady in particular at the moment that's been presented to the job centre 3 times while she's in the middle of challenging her ESA decision. We're still waiting for a mandatory reconsideration outcome before we know whether we need to appeal or not. Once, if we get her to appeal stage, she will be able to get ESA assessment rate money, ESA money, and she won't need to be on the job seekers allowance situation. But while the mandatory reconsideration is on way, she can't do that, so she has to go and claim job seekers allowance. And she's seen 3 different job centre advisors. The first 2 were fine with her and said, we recognise the restrictions on your availability because of your illness, disability, what have you. The third one had her in tears, a very different experience, and he said to her, you have to do 35 hours a week job search, otherwise you're at risk of being sanctioned. So we're kind of waiting to see whether that's going to be a problem for her or not. But in the meantime, her health is not good because she's under that stressful situation.
I wanted to follow up because this is something I've been done quite a lot of work on, had various debates on, and the assurances I've been given by ministers repeatedly is that in that situation, people will be given flexible conditionality, which will take regard to their health situation, and that is happening, and there should be no worries. I mean,
we have experience to the counter. I mean, I dare say there are some that may be working, but we certainly see those where it isn't.
Yeah,
and we have concerns around that.
And I think what I'd like to add as well is that instances of people underclaiming benefits and actually receiving zero income, it wasn't a common experience, but it's something that I've definitely seen in the last 14 months. Even just last Friday, I met someone who was living without any income at all because he was 34, he left work after a shoulder operation and tried to claim for ESA, but was found fit for work. And so he's also got depression problems, and he's having a lot of issues, ongoing debt problems and relationship problems. And I asked him if he was claiming JSA whilst he was awaiting his appeal. And he said he'd just been told at the Citizens Advice that you could actually claim for JSA, but he said, I can't do all the things they'd want me to do. They look at you, you seem fine, but they think he's fit to work, but I'm not. He said, my mind's all over the place. And he said he doesn't want to go back into work while he's not ready, because that'll just make him feel worse with his mental health. So, you know, at the moment he was just sort of struggling on with nothing, no income at all. And like I said, that's not a common experience, but it is something that we've come across, and I think it's something that does need highlighting.
In relation to sanctioning decisions, we've come across this too. We've moved to JSA, and we had somebody who actually tried to commit suicide as a result of the sanction. But one of the problems seems to be that information is not being shared between work programme and the decision maker. So the decision maker doesn't pass the ESA 85 form, which explains what the basis of the ATOS decision has been.
It's something we've picked up.
So the work programme doesn't know about that. And then in reverse, if there's been safeguarding activity in the work programme, that's not then conveyed to the decision maker at Job Centre Plus when they make a decision about a sanction. So although some of this is going on, it's not being fully communicated when a sanction decision is being considered.
Okay, and the last question in this section is Paul.
I'll be as quick as I can. Last evidence session, we discussed with Mind whether financial conditionality and sanctions were an appropriate model for those with a mental health condition. I wonder, Dr. Garthwaite, in what you've observed in Stockton, how you feel, is it possible to develop a model of conditionality that would work for patients with a diagnosed mental health problem who are claiming JSA, that would actually deliver conditionality without the negativity that clearly comes with the financial sanctions that then trap them into a spiral almost?
Yeah, I think at the moment, the people that we're seeing at the food bank, they feel in terms of conditionality, they feel that there's more focus on the responsibilities rather than their rights. So I think, you know, there's the issue of people feel like, you know, they have to fulfil certain responsibilities, obviously certain things that they're having to do.
And which responsibilities do you think would be fair for them to fulfil? Any at all, or should it be non-conditional?
I think it's, in terms of sanctions and people receiving ESA and people with health problems, I think sanctions don't seem to fit with people with health issues, and I think it seems
unsuitable. So that would be no
unsuitable.
Conditions at all then, you would suggest?
I wouldn't be saying no conditions at all, but
I'm just trying to understand what they could look like, that's all.
Yeah, I think any conditions that there are would need to be, from what we've seen, a lot more transparent, a lot more flexible to fit people's health problems, you know, rather than it just being a simple, strict, you know, I know there has to be some sort of, you know, level of conditionality, but I would argue that actually for people who are receiving, you know, employment support allowance and who have health problems, job seekers with health problems, they could do with a bit more of a flexible, sort of more of a personalised approach, really, if that answers your question.
It's largely Mind's answer, I think. Things to be done.
Can I just put a question to you, put to the panels last week, and that part of the reason for this inquiry is to see whether sanctions work in making people more likely or less likely to get into work, and so I'm just asking, do sanctions act as a barrier, in your opinion, to not all people, obviously, but to some people actually accessing the labour market? Just
I think they cause,
yes, no.
From our experience, from a discretionary fund, they cause a crisis that has to be dealt with, gets in the way of people's ability to be fulfilling the conditional requirements of the job seekers allowance or the employment support allowance. So they create another diversion from the work.
And everybody else is nodding.
It puts them in a less good position, and I think the research reflects that. And I mean, the culture of encouraging people into paid work is completely different from a culture of sanctioning. And we were just talking about health conditions. I mean, I just wanted to read a little bit from the Decision Maker's Guide, where basically it's assumed that your health will be damaged by a sanction. It says it would be usual for a normal healthy adult to suffer deterioration in their health if they were without essential items like food, clothing, heating and accommodation, or essential items. The decision maker must determine if a person with a medical condition would suffer a greater decline in health than a normal healthy adult would suffer hardship. So it's assumed deterioration in health is part of the result of a sanctioning regime. So that's just a simple point, but in relation to work activation, that can't be the way to encourage people.
Well, can I thank you very much for coming along this morning. We've got our second panel to come in, so if I can ask you to move quickly, and the people who are in our second